The sun hasn't even cleared the acacia trees yet, and you're already awake. Not because you chose to be. Your body woke you. Something moved 40 feet away in the grass, and every nerve in you is screaming before your conscious mind even catches up. You don't get to hit snooze out here. You don't get a slow morning with coffee and a phone screen. You get a few seconds to decide whether that rustle was wind or whether it was something with teeth that's been watching your little group for the last hour, waiting for exactly this moment, when the light is bad and everyone's still half asleep. Welcome to a single morning, out of thousands, in the life of a creature that isn't quite human yet, but isn't really an animal either. Somewhere caught between the two, walking upright through tall grass on the East African savanna for million years ago. This is the part of our story nobody puts on a t-shirt. We love talking about fire, tools, language, art. The stuff that makes us feel like the main character of evolution. But long before any of that, there was just this. Waking up afraid. Staying afraid. Going to sleep afraid. If sleep even came easily, which it often didn't. So here's the thesis of this video, and it's a simple one. You cannot understand modern human psychology without understanding the absolute terror of being prey. Our anxiety, our hypervigilance, our obsession with status and group belonging, even our tendency to catastrophize over things that don't matter. A lot of that machinery was built for a world where one wrong decision meant you got eaten before lunch. We're going to walk through a single day, hour by hour, in the life of an early hominin around 4 million years ago, somewhere in the Afar region of what's now Ethiopia, where researchers have actually found fossils from this exact window of time. And by the end, I think you'll look at your own brain a little differently, because it's still running survival software in a world that doesn't need it anymore. Let's start with the body you're working with, because it's not built for this the way you'd expect. By 4 million years ago, creatures like Australopithecus anamensis were walking on 2 legs. That's confirmed by fossil evidence, including foot and leg bones found in Kenya that show a clear adaptation to bipedal walking. But here's the catch. They were not good at it yet. Not the way you are. The pelvis was still narrow. The gait was probably a bit awkward, somewhere between a human stride and an ape's waddle. And they still had long arms, curved fingers, shoulders built for climbing. Which tells you something important. These individuals were living in 2 worlds at once. On the ground, where the food was, and in the trees, where safety was. Every single day involved switching between the two, and that switch wasn't graceful. So picture this. You're moving through grass that's taller than your hips in some places. Visibility is terrible. You can't see a leopard until it's already decided your fate. Lions back then weren't the lions you picture in a documentary. There were larger, more aggressive predator species roaming that landscape, along with saber-toothed cats and massive hyena-like scavengers that could crack bone with their jaws. You are not the top of any food chain. You are, frankly, a snack with decent peripheral vision. This is where the first big psychological inheritance comes from: hypervigilance. Modern humans startle at sudden noises, flinch at shadows, feel our heart rate spike when we walk alone at night, even in a perfectly safe neighborhood. Evolutionary psychologists point out that this isn't a glitch, it's a feature that got built for exactly this kind of environment, where the cost of missing a real threat was your life, and the cost of a false alarm was just a wasted adrenaline spike. So the system evolved to be paranoid by design. Better to flinch at 1,000 sticks than miss one snake. That trade-off, made over millions of years in landscapes just like this one, is sitting in your nervous system right now, even though you're reading this in a climate-controlled room with the doors locked. Now let's talk about food, because this is where the day gets its real shape. So you don't have a kitchen. You don't have storage. You don't even have much in the way of tools yet. Stone tool use as we typically picture it, with deliberate flaking and sharp edges, doesn't show up clearly in the archaeological record until roughly 2.5 million years later. So at 4 million years ago, you're working with your hands, your teeth, and whatever opportunistic advantage you can find. Researchers studying dental wear and isotopic signatures from teeth of early hominins around this period have found a diet that was surprisingly broad. Tough plant fibers, fruit, nuts, roots you'd have to dig for, and likely the occasional bit of meat scavenged rather than hunted. The molars from this era show heavy wear patterns consistent with gritty, fibrous food. Basically, you're chewing constantly, and a lot of what you eat fights back a little before it goes down. This means foraging takes up an enormous chunk of the day. Not an hour here and there, most of your waking life. You're walking, often for miles, scanning for ripe fruit or tubers, testing things by smell and texture because trial and error is still how knowledge transfers. There's no recipe book. If a plant made your cousin sick last season, you remember that, and maybe you avoid it, but the information dies with whoever doesn't pass it on. Every meal carries a small gamble. And this is the second psychological inheritance worth sitting with. Our weird, almost irrational relationship with food today probably traces back to a world of chronic, low-grade scarcity. Why do humans hoard, overeat when food is abundant, feel disproportionate anxiety about running out even when the fridge is full? Because for most of our evolutionary history, enough wasn't a stable concept. It fluctuated by season, by drought, by sheer luck. Your brain didn't evolve to trust abundance. It evolved to prepare for the next famine, because the next famine was always coming. Midday, the heat becomes its own predator. East Africa near the equator doesn't do mild. Temperatures climb, and there's no shade structure you've built, just whatever trees happen to be around. So the group, and it would have been a group, since solitary living at this stage was essentially a death sentence, clusters under whatever cover exists. This is probably the safest window of the day in some ways, because most large predators are also avoiding the heat. But it's also when social friction shows up, because you're packed together with the same dozen or so individuals, day after day, with no privacy and no escape valve. This brings us to the third big point, and it's one that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Group living at this stage wasn't a warm, cooperative utopia. It was a tense, constantly negotiated truce. Researchers who study modern primate social structures, chimpanzees, baboons, consistently find hierarchy, competition for food and mates, and real, sometimes violent conflict resolution. There's no reason to think early hominins were dramatically gentler. If anything, the stakes were higher, because the group itself was your only real defense against predators. Banishment wasn't a social inconvenience. It was close to a death sentence. So think about what that does to a psychology. You need the group to survive, but the group is also a constant site of competition for food, for safety in numbers, for whatever passed as status. This is almost certainly where our deep, almost embarrassing sensitivity to social rejection comes from. Why does being excluded from a group chat sting in a way that seems wildly disproportionate to the actual stakes? Why does public criticism feel almost physically painful? Because for an enormous stretch of our evolutionary history, social exclusion genuinely was an existential threat. The brain hasn't fully updated its alarm system for a world where you can survive just fine outside any one particular group. Afternoon brings the next problem: water. Streams and waterholes are gathering points, which sounds convenient until you realize that's exactly where predators station themselves too. Fossil evidence from sites in the Afar region shows a landscape with rivers, lakes, and woodland mixed with open grassland, a mosaic environment, not a uniform savanna. That mix mattered because it offered both food diversity and constant exposure to ambush points. Drinking water means lowering your guard at precisely the location where every predator in the area also wants to be. It's a calculated risk taken multiple times a day, every day, for an entire lifetime. And here's where I want to bring in the fourth point, because it connects all of this together. Decision fatigue isn't a modern invention. Every single one of these moments, foraging choices, water access, group positioning, predator scanning, required constant, low-level calculation with real consequences. Modern psychologists talk about decision fatigue like it's a quirk of office life, something that happens after too many meetings. But the underlying mechanism, the brain's limited capacity for sustained vigilant choice-making, was forged under conditions where bad decisions got you killed, not just mildly inconvenienced. You're not weak for feeling mentally exhausted after a long day of decisions. You're running ancient hardware that was calibrated for life or death stakes, now applied to choosing between 14 brands of cereal. Now, it would be easy to paint this whole picture as relentless misery, nothing but fear and hunger from dawn to dusk. And to be fair, that's the popular narrative: brutal, short, nasty lives, nothing redeeming about it. But that's probably an oversimplification, and a fairly lazy one at that. There's good reason to think early hominins also experienced something like contentment, even joy, in small doses. Social grooming, which we see extensively in living primates and almost certainly existed in early hominins too, isn't just hygiene. It triggers real neurochemical reward, building trust and bonds. The first successful foraging trip of the day probably brought relief, maybe even something like satisfaction. Researchers studying primate behavior describe play, curiosity, and apparent enjoyment in safe, resource-rich moments, not constant misery. Survival pressure was real and constant, but it wasn't the entire emotional spectrum. It's also worth being honest about the limits of what we actually know. We're reconstructing a single hominin's day from fossilized teeth, footprints, isotope ratios in ancient soil, and comparative behavior from living primates. That's genuinely impressive detective work, but it's still inference, not video footage. Different species coexisted across this general time window, and their lives may have varied more than a single tidy narrative suggests. So when anyone, including this video, describes a day in the life, what they're really offering is an educated reconstruction built from fragments, not a documentary transcript. So let's come back to where we started. That rustle in the grass, the moment you woke up afraid before you even knew why. Here's the thing worth sitting with. That fear response never really left. The body and brain you're using right now were assembled, piece by piece, across millions of years in exactly this kind of environment. Fear of predators, anxiety around scarcity, painful sensitivity to social rejection, the mental exhaustion of constant small decisions. None of it disappeared just because we built cities, grocery stores, and group chats. We just took ancient software and pointed it at modern problems it was never designed to solve. The leopard in the grass became a passive-aggressive email from your boss. The hunger for food security became hunger for financial security. The fear of group exclusion became the dread of being left on read. Understanding this doesn't excuse bad behavior or anxious overreaction, but it does explain it. And honestly, there's something almost comforting in realizing your anxiety isn't a personal failure, it's an inheritance. A survival system that worked extremely well for millions of years, just badly mismatched to the world you're actually living in now. If there's a single insight worth carrying out of this, it's this. The next time your heart races over something objectively small, you're not broken. You're a few million years of survival pressure, still doing its job, just in the wrong century. That's the kind of thing this channel exists to dig into. Not just what happened in our distant past, but why it still quietly runs the show in our present. If this kind of deep dive into human behavior and where it actually comes from is your thing, stick around. There's a lot more buried in this story, and we're just getting started.